The rain in Bougainville dropped like sheets of wet iron from a sunless sky. It slammed against the crown of my M1 helmet like gravel dumped onto tin. I sat wedged in cold red clay at the bottom of our foxhole on Hill 700, knees pulled tight, hands locked around my M1 Garand. The woodstock was swollen damp, smelling of linseed oil and river sludge, but the bolt was dry. I had cleaned it 3 times since dusk, praying the firing pin would not freeze in the dark. Beside me, Private First Class Arthur Miller, Artie to everybody back in Pennsylvania, kneeled on his right knee, his back pressed against the mud wall of the dugout. His BAR rested across the parapet, bipod sinking into mud. Artie had not looked at anything closer than 20 yards since sunset. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring into the black wall of vines ahead. He was terrified of what was crawling in the dark. Even through the roar of the cloudburst, I heard the wet sound of his right thumb, calloused from his years in the Altoona shops, rubbing over his BAR receiver. "You're going to rub the finish right off that steel, Artie," I whispered against the deluge. He did not turn his head. His thumb kept moving in tight circles across the metal. "Iron doesn't bend for rain, Tommy," he muttered. "Iron holds up fine. But we ain't made of iron. You know that, don't you? We're just soft meat wrapped in wet cotton." Before I could answer, the jungle 20 feet out seemed to shift. It was a sharp, metallic clack snip, cutting clean through the storm. Artie froze. His thumb stopped dead against the bar receiver. It was the unmistakable sound of wire cutters snapping perimeter barbed wire 5 yards from our trench. Down the line, half buried, under a poncho dripping red sludge, Sergeant Rick Dawson crouched low behind a timber revetment. A trip flare burst near the ravine edge, blooming into a harsh white star beneath the canopy. In that ghostly illumination, Dawson's face looked carved out of yellow soap as he peered into shadows. "Hold the line," Dawson growled down the trench, his voice carrying the authority of a Youngstown coal yard foreman. "Hold the line, or the jungle eats us whole." The flare flickered out, plunging us back into darkness. 3 weeks earlier, when the ramp of our LST dropped into the surf at Empress Augusta Bay, I thought I understood heat. Back in Pittsburgh, 12-hour shifts at the steel foundry made me think physical labor could prepare a man for anything. But Bougainville was a green steam bath where humidity felt like warm grease in your lungs. The moment our combat boots touched black volcanic sand on the beachhead, the island claimed us. Damp heat soaked through our HBT fatigues, rubbing skin raw within hours. We assembled on the beach beneath palm trees, the air heavy with decaying vegetation and wet wool. The 145th Infantry Regiment was moving inland to establish a defensive perimeter around Piva airstrip. Sergeant Dawson lined us up along the tree line. Before we marched into the green wall, he pulled a small metal Atabrine tin from his shirt pocket. Dawson tapped his Atabrine tin against my helmet, tap tap, before swallowing his pill. He unscrewed his aluminum canteen, tasting of halazone tablets and hot rubber. "Take your medicine, boys," Dawson snapped, tossing a tin to Artie. "The mosquitoes carry a fever that will turn your blood to swamp water. Drink up and keep moving. Hold the line, or the jungle eats us whole." I swallowed my pill, feeling bitter powder on my tongue. I pulled out my scrap of white steel foundry chalk from Pittsburgh and tucked it into my helmet band beside a dried leaf. It felt like an anchor connecting me to a clean sky back home. The march up to Hill 700 was 5 miles of misery through liquid red clay. Thick red clay dragged down our boots like wet cement. None of us knew then that 500 yards below us, in the dark jungle canopy, 4,000 veterans of the Japanese 6th Division were already massing in the ravines, waiting for midnight to turn Hill 700 into a slaughterhouse. Giant banyan trees arched overhead, massive roots twisting across mud like frozen serpents. Sweat ran in stinging rivers down our foreheads, salt burning into raw, insect-bitten eyelids as we hauled gear up the ridge. I carried my M1 rifle, 8 bandoliers of .30-06 ammunition, 2 fragmentation grenades, and a full pack. Artie struggled alongside me with the heavy BAR, sinking deep into muck. Halfway up, where the trail pinched along Ravine B, we stumbled upon a collapsed timber dugout. Roof logs had caved in under a mortar blast, half buried in red muck. Artie halted, wiping bloodshot eyes with his sleeve, staring into the dark opening. "Hey, Sarge," Artie called out, his voice shaking. "Should we check down in Ravine B? Could be intel down in that hole, or maybe somebody left behind." Sergeant Dawson did not stop. He did not turn his head to look into the ravine. His face hardened, lips drawing back in a flat line. "Keep your eyes on the ridge, Miller," Dawson barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of cicadas. "We don't look into Ravine B. We don't clear Ravine B. Nobody goes down there, and nobody asks about what happened in that pit." "Move your ass!" Artie opened his mouth to ask why, but the look in Dawson's eyes shut him up instantly. Whatever happened in Ravine B was something Dawson refused to speak about, hanging over us like a shroud. As Dawson pushed past us to take the lead, I noticed the way his gait hitched. He walked with unnatural stiffness in his left leg. Severe jungle rot was eating away the skin of his feet, yet Dawson never complained. He just forced his feet through mud. By the time we reached the crest of Hill 700, the sun was sinking behind peaks of the Emperor Range. Hill 700 was a razor-thin ridge overlooking Piva airstrip. If lost, Japanese artillery would destroy the bombers below. We spent remaining hours of daylight digging in, carving foxholes directly into the steep slope. Red clay was packed tight around thick banyan roots, chopping through wood while rain drizzled down. Air smelled of sulfur fumes drifting down from active volcanoes inland, mingling with the sweet stench of decaying jungle floor, cordite smoke from earlier skirmishes, and wet wool uniforms that never dried. Daily Atabrine rations gave us the look of walking ghosts. When night fell, the jungle changed. In daytime, the forest was loud with birds. At night, it became absolute blackness, where every dropping leaf sounded like a crawling soldier. We sat in watch pairs, taking turns staring into shadows until eyes strained. Mosquitoes swarmed around our faces, but we could not slap them for fear of revealing our positions to snipers probing the perimeter. We didn't know it yet, but in less than 2 hours, the wire out front would snap, and half the men sitting along this ridge would be fighting for their lives with bayonets and bare hands in the flooded mud. Artie sat beside me in our pit, his BAR resting across the parapet. His Altoona background gave him a mechanic's respect for machinery, but the jungle had stripped away his composure. He kept my eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the dark, terrified that if he closed them for a second, an Arasaka bayonet would plunge through rain into my chest. "I repaired steam locomotives for the Pennsylvania Railroad, Artie whispered into Rain, his voice barely audible over dripping leaves. Big iron boilers, 100-ton engines. You could hit them with a sledgehammer, and they rang out clear. But here, everything rots. Leather rots, canvas rots, wood rots. Even iron gets pitted if you don't grease it twice a day. Iron doesn't bend for rain, Tommy. But we ain't made of iron. We're going to break up here. I can feel it." "Shut up, Artie," I whispered back, though my own heart was hammer-striking against my ribs. "Just watch the wire." That first night passed in nerve-shredding silence, but it was only the quiet before the storm. At 0700 the next morning, March 9th, Sergeant Rick Dawson sloshed down the slumping timberline of our main trench, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the heavy rain. He stopped outside our dugout, pulled a small, rectangular tin from his breast pocket, and struck it twice against the crown of my M1 helmet. That sharp, metallic double tap was the morning bell on Hill 700. "Take 'em, boys," Dawson grunted, his voice rasping like a handsaw working through wet pine. "Hold the line, or the jungle eats us whole." Dawson pried open the lid and tipped a pair of small, bright yellow tablets into my cupped palm. Atabrine, the Army's chemical wall against malaria. I brought the pill to my tongue and unhooked the aluminum canteen from my web belt. The water inside was lukewarm and tasted foul, heavy with the chemical bite of halazone purification tablets and the oily tang of vulcanized canteen rubber. I swallowed hard, but the yellow pill caught in the back of my dry throat for a second, leaving a bitter film on my tongue. I looked up at Dawson as he moved down the trench line toward the machine gun pit. He moved with a slight, unnatural hitch in his right leg, leaning his weight heavily against the timber wall whenever I thought no one was watching. He would die before he admitted it to the platoon commander or the medic, but I had seen his feet when he peeled his socks off 2 nights ago. Jungle rot was eating through his heels, yet Dawson bore it in silence, refusing to let the jungle beat him. Around us, every man in the 145th Infantry was turning yellow. The daily dose of Atabrine stained our skin a sickly, jaundiced hue and turned the whites of our eyes into pale mustard. Artie looked like a ghost dipped in sulfur. The jungle had stripped 20 pounds off his frame in 3 weeks. Artie sat on an empty mortar crate with flannel in hand, his thumb polishing the steel receiver of his BAR. "Iron doesn't bend for rain, Tommy," Artie muttered, his voice barely carrying over the steady roar of water hitting the banana leaves above us. "But we ain't made of iron." "Keep rubbing it like that, and you'll wear the steel down to the firing pin, Artie," I said, leaning back against the sandbag parapet and feeling the cold water seep through my canvas jacket. "Better thin steel than jammed steel when the night comes," he replied without looking up. His thumb kept moving, polishing the receiver until the blued metal gleamed dully under the gray light of the canopy. He paused for a moment, reached inside his shirt, and pulled out a damp, twice-folded sheet of cheap writing paper tucked into a grease-proof ration wrapper. It was a letter I had pinched out of his older brother's duffel bag back in Altoona the night before he boarded the troop train. He didn't read it out loud, he never did, but he held it under the edge of his rubber poncho, scanning the pencil lines for the 100th time, looking for something solid to anchor himself to before the darkness rolled back over the ridge. By mid-morning, heat rose out of the ravine in thick waves, bringing the smell of cordite and unburied dead. Above us, Japanese snipers were tied high in giant banyan trees with palm fiber ropes so their bodies wouldn't fall. Snipers fired Arisaka rifles with smokeless powder. You only heard the sharp report before a slug hit sandbags. "Keep your heads below the logs," Dawson shouted from down the line. A burst of sniper fire ripped through the fern fronds directly over our pit, clipping a leafy branch that fell floating into the muddy sump at my feet. We spent the afternoon hauling mud. The constant deluge had softened the steep slopes of Hill 700 until whole sections of trench wall were slumping into the crawlways. Me and Artie worked with short-handled trench shovels, scooping the heavy red clay out of the water channels and packing it into burlap sandbags. My forearms burned with fatigue. Back home, you dropped your shovel when the whistle blew. But here, if you stopped shoveling, the trench collapsed, and the next mortar caught you standing in the open. Every mortar shell tree burst sent hot iron shrapnel singing through the clearing. Spent brass casings dropped into trench puddles with every burst. My fingertips peeled from being submerged in water for days. The jungle rot was starting between my knuckles now. Small, red, itchy blisters that burned like fire whenever salt sweat ran down my wrists. I paused to check the action of my M1 Garand. I pulled back my Garand bolt, checking the 8-round clip. Despite rifle grease, beads of rust formed on the steel barrel within hours. In this place, everything was breaking down. Leather rotted into green grease, canvas molded black, and ration labels dissolved into pulp. The sun didn't set on Hill 700. The sky simply turned from the dull gray of wet lead to an absolute smothering blackness. At 5 o'clock, the tropical storm returned with a vengeance. The cloudburst hammering down so hard that you couldn't see the man standing 3 feet away in the trench. Darkness settled over the ridge, cutting off every visual landmark. Night watch was a special kind of torment. Me and Artie sat back to back in the narrow fire trench, our ponchos buttoned together over our knees to keep the worst of the runoff from cascading into our boots. My eyes burned from the salt sweat that continuously trickled into my insect-bitten eyelids, but I didn't dare close them for more than a second at a time. The blackness was so thick, it felt solid, pressing against your pupils until your brain started creating shapes out of the void. Shadows that moved against shadows, twisted banyan roots that looked like crouching men, the swaying of fern leaves that sounded like the rustle of uniform cloth. Artie's fragility showed its worst face after dark. He was terrified of night infiltration, terrified of the quiet blade in the dark that comes without the warning of an artillery whistle. I sat with his BAR rested across his knees, my face turned toward the darkness outside the perimeter wire. His eyes were stretched wide, unblinking, straining so hard to see into the pitch-black jungle that the whites of my eyes were bloodshot and raw, the tiny capillaries bursting from the pressure. He refused to sleep, even when it was my turn to take the watch. He just sat there, breathing through his teeth, his calloused thumb dragging rhythmically over the steel receiver of his weapon, over and over, a desperate, silent rosary against the dark. Around 9 o'clock, the jungle quieted down just enough between thunderclaps for the small, terrifying sounds to creep in. Out in the wire, 5 yards beyond the parapet, something clicked. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch or a rat crawling through the leaf litter. It was the sharp, metallic snap of wire cutters nipping through high-tensile American steel barbed wire. I froze, my hand instantly tightening around the cold wooden stock of my M1 Garand. Beside me, Artie's breathing stopped completely. Then came the smell. The rain was heavy, but the wind shifted for a brief 3 seconds, blowing up from the floor of the steep ravine directly below our bunker. Rising on the warm draft was a scent that didn't belong to the wet jungle. The pungent, sharp tang of sulfur matches and the acrid, low-grade stink of cheap Japanese tobacco smoke drifting up from beneath the root-tangled floorboards of the forest slope. They were down there, infiltrators from waves of enemy assault troops, crawling through the red mud under the cover of the downpour, dragging their knee mortars and satchel charges behind them, inching closer to our wire with every crack of thunder. My heart hammered against my ribs like a sledge hitting an anvil. The sweat running into my eyes burned like lye, but I didn't dare wipe it away. The night on Hill 700 was no longer just wet and miserable. It was alive with the unseen presence of men who had come to die and take us with them into the mud. I lifted my Garand slowly, slipping the safety catch off with a faint, silent click, and stared out into the roaring black rain, waiting for the first shadow to leap over the wire. Beside me, Private First Class Artie Miller knelt on a submerged sandbag, his wide eyes straining into the dark, until the vessels throbbed with agony. Artie's thumb, thick and calloused from years of wrenching steam valves in the Altoona locomotive yards, moved in a compulsive circle over the receiver of his BAR. Again and again, he wiped away the red silt creeping into the breach, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, slumped against the log revetment, Sergeant Rick Dawson dragged his leg out of the foul water. Beneath his boots, jungle rot had eaten Dawson's heels down to raw, bleeding wounds, an agonizing torture he had hidden for a week. His jaw was set like iron, his hand resting on his Colt pistol. Then came the sound. It was not the thunder of heavy artillery, but a subtle, mechanical snip, the cold bite of wire cutters severing the bottom strand of perimeter barbed wire 40 yards down the razorback ridge. My heart slammed against my ribs like a sledgehammer hitting a cold ingot. I reached down and adjusted the canvas ammunition belt, feeling the brass cartridges slick with rainwater. Before I could call out, the night split wide open. A barrage of Japanese 90mm mortars and Type 89 knee mortars tore through the banyan canopy. The upper jungle erupted in a blinding cascade of orange fire and flying timber. Tree bursts rained down razor-sharp shrapnel, teak splinters, and heavy clods of red clay into the open trenches. The concussive shockwaves punched the air straight out of my lungs, throwing me against the tripod. The mud in the pit churned under nearby explosions, filling the dark with scorched sulfur and pulverized earth. A shell detonated directly on the parapet, 10 feet to our left. The blast blew out the sandbag retaining wall, burying me to my waist in heavy soil. Through the ringing in my ears and the blinding white phosphorus, I heard Sergeant Dawson scream. I clawed out of the mud and turned. A piece of jagged steel had ripped through Dawson's web gear, tearing open his fatigue jacket along the ribs. The metal had struck Dawson's tin of Atabrine pills, shattering the container into twisted scrap. A cloud of bright yellow pills spilled from the ruined tin, scattering across the bloody water of the trench floor. Dawson clutched his bleeding side, his face pale as chalk in the burning brushlight, but forced himself upright against the wall. He spat blood and pointed his Colt toward the wire. "Hold the line," Dawson roared, his voice cracking against the thunder of mortars, "or this goddamn jungle eats us whole." Down the slope, out of the rain and fog of cordite, the darkness took human shape. Hundreds of soldiers from the Imperial Japanese 6th Division surged up the steep incline of Hill 700. They came in a wave of fixed bayonets and khaki uniforms, screaming their battle cries into the storm. Illumination flares, drifting beneath the clouds, cast long shadows across the slope, lighting up the glint of steel bayonets creeping through the gaps in the wire. I grabbed the spade grips of the M1919A4, pulled the cocking handle back twice, and squeezed the thumb trigger. The machine gun roared into life, pounding out 700 rounds per minute. Tracer fire streaked across the dark ravine in red lines, cutting through the brush into the charging ranks. Hot brass casings erupted from the receiver, clattering onto the floor plate before dropping into the flooded puddle around my boots with a sharp hiss. The muzzle flash illuminated my face, my cheekbones smeared with soot and red clay, my hollow eyes burning with primal survival. Beside me, Artie's BAR chattered in controlled 3-round bursts, the .30 caliber slugs knocking down attackers as they tried to breach the inner concertina wire. But the Japanese assault was relentless. They scrambled over the bodies of their fallen comrades, using them as stepping stones to cross the mud-choked wire entanglements. A mortar round landed inside the neighboring squad's pit, clearing the position in a sudden burst of flame. In the brief pause of fire, a slurry of thick red clay and pulverized root fiber shot across the revetment, splashing directly into the exposed feed tray of my Browning. I squeezed the trigger. The heavy gun fired 3 rapid shots, choked on a mouthful of grit, and went dead with a dull thud. "Feed tray is fouled," I screamed, my voice swallowed by the storm. I lunged forward, slapping the cover latch back to clear the breach, but the enemy was already over the lip of the bunker. 2 Japanese soldiers leaped into the flooded machine gun pit, their long Arisaka rifles with fixed bayonets lunging through the rain. One bayonet caught me across the forearm, slicing through my HBT sleeve and scoring a burning trench along my muscle. The force knocked me backward into the red water. Before the soldier could drive the blade home, Sergeant Dawson fired 3 .45 rounds from his Colt, lifting the attacker off his feet and throwing him back over the sandbags. But the second infiltrator was already on top of Dawson, pinning the wounded sergeant into the mud with a raised trench knife. I did not hesitate. The steel foundry in Pittsburgh had taught me how to handle heavy iron, but the jungle had turned me into an animal. I grabbed a discarded entrenching tool, drove myself upward from the mud, and swung the folded spade with all my strength. The edge caught the attacker beneath the helmet, and the fight devolved into a chaotic struggle in the pitch dark. I wrestled the man into the flooded sump, my hands buried in wet cloth, fighting for leverage until the water went still. Above them, the perimeter line was collapsing. Dozens of Japanese soldiers were leaping into the main trench network, engaged in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and rifle butts. The rain turned the entire crest of Hill 700 into a churning cauldron of red mud, blood, and screaming men. Artie Miller stood alone on the parapet, his silhouette illuminated by the dying glow of a flare. His terror of the dark had vanished, burned away by white-hot adrenaline. He fired his BAR from the hip, sweeping the tree line, spent casings raining down like copper hail. Suddenly, as Artie swung the rifle toward a group of satchel-charged throwers creeping up the bunker's right flank, a burst of liquid mud splashed directly into the BAR's open ejection port. The bolt drove forward, caught a grain of silica sand in the receiver channel, and jammed half-inch short of battery. The firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. Artie stared at the weapon. For days, Artie had obsessively rubbed his calloused thumb over that steel receiver, keeping it clean in the wet hell of the Solomons. Now, with 3 charging enemy soldiers less than 15 yards away, his mechanic's muscle memory took command. With blood running from a shrapnel graze on his temple, Artie slammed his palm against the cocking handle, forcing the stubborn bolt back against the spring. His thick Altoona thumb dug into the receiver, clearing the crushed casing and dragging the abrasive sand out of the channel in one violent motion. He let the bolt fly forward, locking a fresh .30 caliber round into the chamber. "Iron doesn't bend for rain, Tommy!" Artie screamed over the roar of the storm. "But we ain't made of iron!" Artie raised the BAR to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, spitting a wall of lead that cut down the 3 attackers in mid-stride. He stood exposed on the sandbags under small arms fire, feeding magazine after magazine into the weapon with slick, bleeding hands. He moved like a human mechanism of forged steel and bone, refusing to yield an inch of the muddy ridge. Below Artie, in the pit, I frantically wiped the feed tray of the M1919A4 with a dry corner of my undershirt, ignoring the burning pain in my slashed forearm. I relayed the cloth ammunition belt, slammed the cover shut, and racked the bolt. "It's clear!" I yelled. "Get down, Artie!" Artie dropped back into the pit just as enemy rifle fire chewed through the sandbags where I was standing. I gripped the spade handles and opened fire once more. The browning chatter resumed its terrifying rhythm, the barrel glowing cherry red through the downpour as steam hissed off the perforated steel jacket like a ruptured locomotive boiler. I swung the gun in wide arcs across the northern slope, locking my elbows, holding the thumb trigger down, until the belt ran dry. Alongside me, Dawson, half-conscious and propped against the revetment among the crushed yellow Atabrine pills, kept reloading bar magazines with trembling fingers, passing them up to Artie. For 45 agonizing minutes, the three men held the breach at the center of Hill 700. They poured thousands of rounds into the darkness, throwing Mk2 fragmentation grenades into the ravenous approaches until their hands were raw and their fingers bled. The heavy, tropical rain never slackened, washing red clay from the parapet into the trench until the water at their knees turned a deep, rust-colored crimson. By 4:30 in the morning, the violent waves of human assault began to falter. The screams of the attackers faded into the dripping gloom of the jungle below, replaced by the low groans of the wounded trapped in the barbed wire. The relentless pounding of the enemy mortars slacked off, leaving only the sound of heavy rain striking shattered trees. Inside the machine gun pit, the air was thick with the suffocating stench of cordite, burnt oil, blood, and wet wool. The Browning's barrel was smoking, its steel casing scorched black. I released the spade grips, my fingers locked in cramp, my arms trembling violently as adrenaline drained from my body. I collapsed backward against the mud-slicked revetment, my chest heaving, my eyes wide and hollow as I stared up at the torn canopy above. Blood trickled down my HBT sleeve from the bayonet cut, mixing with the red clay caked onto my skin. Beside me, Artie slumped over his BAR, his head resting against the weapon's hot receiver. His thumb was still resting on the steel, stained yellow from the dissolved Atabrine pills floating in the water around his knees. He was breathing heavily, his shoulders shaking in silence as the rain washed the black soot from his face. On the floor of the trench, Sergeant Dawson lay quiet, his hand still clutching his wounded side. His eyes were open, tracking the gray, misty light of dawn as it begins to bleed through the shattered branches overhead. The counterattack had failed. Hill 700 still belonged to the Buckeye Division, but as I looked around the ruined pit, at the shattered Atabrine tin, the piles of spent brass sinking into the mud, and the dark shapes tangled in the wire outside, I knew that whatever had survived this night on Bougainville was no longer the men who had marched up from the beach. Dawn did not arrive on Hill 700 with light, but with a pale grayness seeping through the canopy like oil over water. The downpour thinned to a drizzle in 98% dampness. A suffocating silence settled over the ridge, pressing like heavy iron. There were no birds singing, no cicadas humming. There was only the endless drip of condensation falling from torn banyan leaves into flooded craters where men had killed in the dark. Dawson reached down and pulled out his metal Atabrine tin. The lid was scuffed to bare brass by weeks of grinding against the mud. Out of muscle memory, the sergeant raised the tin and tapped it 3 times against his steel helmet, a sharp click cutting through the mist. I stared into the open tin at yellow tablets swimming in rainwater, then snapped it shut. Dawson adjusted his weight with a quiet wince, grimacing against the burn of severe jungle rot eating into his feet inside his boots. "Hold the line," Dawson rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel grinding in a tin cup. His eyes drifted toward the tangled slope where the Japanese 6th Division had thrown their infantry through the wire. "Hold the line, or the jungle eats us whole." I did not answer. My throat was raw from inhaling cordite smoke, sulfur matches, and the sweet stench of decaying vegetation. I looked down at my right hand. My knuckles were stripped raw where I had cleared a jammed casing from the machine gun, while knee mortars snapped the banyan crowns overhead. Where dense emerald rainforest had stood 3 days prior, there was now only a scorched wasteland of red mud and splintered stumps. Heavy artillery had stripped every leaf and vine, leaving pale wooden spines jutting into the sky like stranded ribs. In shallow craters, water collected in dark pools. Down the slope, movement broke the quiet, the thud of canvas jungle boots dragging through deep mud. A relief column from the 145th Infantry Regiment picked its way up the trail, carrying wooden litters and rolls of canvas. They moved like ghosts through the fog, silent and solemn. I pushed myself up from the mud pit, my knees cracking under wet equipment. My boots felt like lead, cold red clay clinging in heavy clods. I walked slowly toward the crest of the ridge, where the main banzai assault had crashed against the wire before dawn. There, crumpled in a crater beside a coil of barbed wire, lay Private First Class Artie Miller. Artie was slumped sideways over his Browning automatic rifle, half submerged in muddy water. His eyes were wide open, staring fixedly at the gray fog above, unblinking, just as during the terrifying hours of night watch when the dread of infiltration had threatened to tear my mind apart. Even in death, his calloused right thumb remained pressed against the steel receiver of his BAR, the gesture I had repeated thousands of times, rubbing away grit and mud that threatened to jam the action. I knelt in the cold clay beside my friend. The misting rain trickled down Artie's hollow cheeks, washing away the red mud streaking his jaw, making him look impossibly young. A 22-year-old locomotive repairman from Altoona who had loved the heavy iron engines of the Pennsylvania Railroad. "Iron doesn't bend for rain, Tommy," I whispered, repeating the words Artie had spoken in the pitch-black dugout 2 nights before. "But we ain't made of iron." A sharp knot tightened in my chest. I reached out and gently closed Artie's eyelids, shielding them from the gray sky. I tried to unlace Artie's fingers from the receiver, but the steel frame was clamped tight in the rigor of death. 2 litter bearers approached, their fatigue shirts dark with sweat. They laid a canvas stretcher in the mud next to Artie. I helped them lift the boy, my heart heavy as slag cooled in a foundry pit. By noon, the rain ceased, replaced by dense steam rising from the forest floor as heat pressed down through cloud cover. At the base of Hill 700, on a terrace of red clay, the men of the 145th established a temporary clearing for the dead. Rows of bodies, wrapped in poncho blankets, lay side by side on damp earth. Simple crosses, fashioned from K-ration crates by regimental carpenters, stood planted in fresh mounds of red soil. But the wood was raw and unmarked, swept blank by moisture hanging in the air. I stood before the wooden marker at the head of Artie's grave. I reached my hand up to the brim of my M1 steel helmet. My fingers fumbled along the rubber camouflage band, holding netting to the shell. Embedded inside the band, preserved against the damp rot, was a cylinder of hard white chalk. Industrial marking chalk I had slipped into my helmet band on my final shift at the steel foundry in Pittsburgh before reporting to the draft board in 1942. It was a remnant of a former life used to write heat numbers and steel grades on glowing ingots of iron. I pulled the chalk free, the white cylinder cold between my fingers. I stepped up to the raw wooden cross and carved the letters into the wood. PFC Arthur Miller, 145th Infantry Regiment, 37th Division, Altoona, Pennsylvania, March 10, 1944. I moved to the next cross, and the next, my hands working in solemn rhythm under the watchful silence of the surviving men. I wrote the names of the boys from Youngstown, Akron, and Pittsburgh, foundry workers, coal miners, and clerks, swallowed by the red clay of Bougainville. The white chalk stood out sharp against dark wood, a stark human testament left behind where nature seemed desperate to erase every trace of man. By late afternoon, the order came down for the surviving elements of the regiment to pull back from Hill 700. The perimeter was secured. The Japanese counteroffensive was broken. Their regiments shattered against the ridgeline. Fresh troops moved up, while exhausted veterans were ordered down to Empress Augusta Bay for rest and evacuation. I slung my M1 Garand over my shoulder. I walked beside Sergeant Dawson, who limped heavily, leaning on a stick carved from a palm branch. Dawson's face was pale, but he refused a litter, dragging his rotting foot through the mire with fierce pride. As the trail dipped down into the lower jungle, I turned my head to look back one last time. As the dawn light broke over Hill 700, I looked down into Ravine B. The dark shadows that had haunted our perimeter all night were gone, leaving only broken branches and silence under the misty banyan canopy. Hill 700 towered over the canopy, a jagged monolith standing against the Pacific sky. Already, the jungle was beginning its march to reclaim the battlefield. Thick creepers were crawling over abandoned dugouts, and damp rot was settling back into trenches. In weeks, tropical rain would wash away foot tracks, spent brass casings, and scorch marks. Only the wooden crosses on the terrace would remain, standing silent guard beneath the banyan trees. They reached Piva airstrip near evening, a blur of naval engines, transport planes landing on metal Marsden matting, and exhaust fumes mixing with salt spray. On the black sand beach of Empress Augusta Bay, rows of landing craft bobbed in the surf, waiting to transport the wounded out to ships anchored in the bay. I sat down on a waterlogged supply crate near the surf. I unlaced my canvas jungle boots, my fingers stiff. When I pulled off my wool socks, strips of dead skin peeled away, the toll of jungle rot from weeks in flooded trenches. I dipped my feet into the cool salt water, the air feeling clean at last. I looked across the dark water of the bay. The sun was setting behind the volcanic peaks of Bougainville, casting a deep glow over the clouds. Beside me, Dawson sat silently, gazing at the horizon, his metal Atabrine tin resting idle in his lap. Neither man spoke. There were no words of victory, no cheers. They had survived, but the cost was etched into the hollow lines of their faces, the yellowing tint of their skin, and the permanent silence settled between them. Late October, 1945, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The war had been over for 2 months, but in the quiet apartment overlooking the Monongahela River, the silence felt different. Decades later, I sit at a small, polished wooden table in my kitchen in Pittsburgh. Afternoon sun shines brightly through a clean glass window pane, illuminating the warm room. Outside, the familiar hum of streetcars and distant clatter of steel mills fill the autumn air. On the table sits a mug of coffee, steam rising in gentle coils. I wear a clean white cotton shirt and pressed trousers. My hair is trimmed neat, my face smooth and shaven. My hands rest flat on the polished oak surface. I stared down at my fingers. They were clean. I had scrubbed them 3 times that morning, with lye soap and warm water. There was no grease from the foundry, no soot from coal furnaces. Yet, as I look at the pale skin around my knuckles and beneath my fingernails, I can still feel it, a cold, wet, heavy weight lingering deep within the grain of my skin, the dark suction of red Bougainville mud that no soap, warm water, or passing of time could ever wash away. Whenever autumn rain fell against the window pane, tapping with a heavy thud, like gravel thrown against tin, my mind was pulled back 3,000 miles across the ocean. I am no longer in a warm kitchen in Pennsylvania. I am kneeling in a flooded crater on Hill 700, smelling cordite, hearing the metallic click of Dawson's tin against my helmet, and watching white chalk crumble against a wooden cross in the tropical rain. I understand now what the war had taken from me. It had not merely tested my strength or stolen my youth. It had stripped away the comforting illusion that a man could ever truly leave the battlefield behind. I survived the jungle, but the jungle has taken up residence inside my soul, a permanent weight I will carry until the day I die. I closed my hands into tight fists, pressing my palms against the dry wood of the table, holding on to the warmth of the room, while outside, the rain continued to fall. If you feel these forgotten records, and the courage of the men who walked through that Pacific mud deserve to be remembered, leave a sign of respect by subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts or your own family's history in the comments below. It helps ensure their sacrifices are never lost to time.